Why is there a sealed envelope stuck behind the mirror cabinet in my mother's abandoned salon? The glass is streaked with decades of dust. The wooden frame warped and gray from years of neglect, and the faint scent of hairspray and rotting varnish lingers in the air. At 60, Margaret's hands are lined with years of work and worry, and yet they tremble as she brushes the grime away, revealing a crease of paper that promises to rewrite everything she thought she knew about her family. The salon, long shuttered, is a crumbling relic of her mother's life, its floorboards squeaking underfoot, and the faded sign outside threatening to collapse with the next gust of wind. No one else in the family wanted it, calling it worthless. Yet here it stands, holding something neither she nor they had anticipated. Margaret didn't pull the envelope out immediately. Her fingers stayed frozen against the edge of the mirror cabinet, as if the paper might dissolve the moment she disturbed it. Dust clung to her skin in thin gray streaks, and the salon around her felt louder now. Every creak of wood, every distant hum of traffic outside the broken window sharpening into something almost accusing. She finally slipped the envelope free and held it close to her chest, not opening it yet, just feeling its weight. It was heavier than it should have been, not because of paper, but because of everything it represented. Behind her, a fallen styling chair shifted slightly under its own broken balance, making a soft metallic groan that echoed through the empty room. 3 days earlier, that same weight had not been paper. It had been her entire life collapsing in smaller, quieter ways that no one else saw. That morning, she had stood in line at the pharmacy with a prescription she did not have enough money to fully cover, counting coins in her palm while the clerk avoided her eyes. The total came to $48.72, and she had exactly $43 in her wallet. She left with only half the medication, folding the paper receipt twice until it became soft at the edges. Back home, the landlord's notice was still taped to her apartment door, yellow paper curling at the corners. Final notice: 7 days to vacate. Inside, her kitchen sink dripped steadily into a stained bowl because she couldn't afford a plumber, and the electricity bill on the table carried a red stamp threatening disconnection within 48 hours. Her checking account balance on the cracked phone screen had shown $211.08 that morning, a number so small it felt like an insult rather than survival. And then there was the call from her sister 2 days earlier, brief, polite, and sharp underneath like broken glass. "Margaret, no one wants that old place. Just sign it over and stop making this difficult for everyone." The word place had sounded like an erasure, not a memory. In the salon now, she sat slowly on the edge of a dust-covered counter, still holding the envelope. Her hands, once steady enough to hold scissors and dye brushes for hours, trembled slightly as she finally broke the seal. The paper inside was older than she expected, folded carefully, with ink faint but deliberate. As she unfolded it halfway, she noticed something else. Beneath the main document, a second sheet, thinner, almost hidden by intention, stamped with a county seal she didn't recognize at first glance. Her breath caught when she saw a name typed at the top of the second page, slightly altered, as if someone had tried to rewrite history with a single correction mark that never fully covered the truth. Outside the broken window, a car passed slowly on the empty street, its headlights dragging across the salon floor for a brief second before disappearing. Margaret stared at the altered line on the document, her pulse tightening, because it wasn't just a name that had been changed. It was the ownership record of the entire building, and someone had gone out of their way to make sure she would never see this version of it until now, when everything else in her life had already fallen apart, and the salon was suddenly no longer just an inheritance, but something far more dangerous than anyone in her family had admitted. Margaret stepped back from the mirror cabinet, the envelope clutched against her chest, and looked around the dim, abandoned salon as if seeing it for the first time. The peeling wallpaper hung like rags from the walls, curling at the edges where moisture had crept in over decades. Broken styling chairs were tipped sideways, their metal bases rusty, wires fraying from dangling hair dryers that had long lost power. The floorboards creaked under her weight, sending dust motes dancing in the shafts of late morning sunlight filtering through cracked blinds. 3 weeks earlier, she had signed the deed to this building, a relic her siblings had openly mocked, calling it a dump nobody wants, and her ex-husband had added, That place is worthless. Just sell it and be done. Even the county clerk at the courthouse had smirked as she slid the deed across the counter, whispering, "Parcel 47-092? Never seen anyone take that one." Margaret had paid $750 of her last emergency savings to take possession, covering unpaid taxes and back fees, and had driven 4 hours across 2 counties in a rattling Ford Focus, the odometer climbing past 160,000 miles, just to step inside a building that everyone else had abandoned to rot. The salon smelled of dust, mold, and stale hairspray, a scent that made her stomach knot, but her heart beat faster with the realization that this could be her last chance. She ran her fingers over the brass key that came with the deed, noting how it didn't quite fit the lock on the front door, rattling and refusing to turn fully, and yet it was hers to hold. Even the small map she had taken from the clerk's desk bore a red circle around the property, hand-drawn, as if marking a secret others had overlooked, and a man who had lingered at the back of the courthouse auction shuffled away quickly the moment she passed, his gaze flicking toward her as though he had been waiting for someone else. Margaret crouched and touched a scuffed corner of the floor, her palm leaving a gray streak, realizing that every cracked tile, every warped panel, every discarded bottle of hair lotion was part of the space she now controlled. A space that had been dismissed, ridiculed, and deemed worthless. But here it was, standing silent and waiting. She exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax despite the tension in her jaw, and slid the key back into the envelope, her fingers lingering on the paper edge as she traced the embossed seal. The sunlight glinted off a faint crease in the corner of the deed she had not noticed before, as if nudging her attention toward a secret layer hidden within the mundane. For a moment, she simply sat on the dusty floor, staring at the salon in all its neglected glory, knowing with a quiet, almost shocking certainty that this abandoned, ridiculed building, everyone's laughingstock, was the last door left to her, the only chance to reclaim something that had been denied, overlooked, or hidden from her for decades. And in her hand, the key and deed felt heavier than gold, though she had no idea what exactly they had been waiting for all these years. Margaret pushed the warped front door of the abandoned salon and stepped inside for the first time, the key still trembling in her hand as the lock resisted with a dry metallic scrape. The sound echoed through the empty space like something waking up after a long sleep. Inside, the air was heavier than she expected, thick with old hairspray, damp wood, and the faint chemical ghost of dye and peroxide that had soaked into the walls decades ago. Light slipped through the cracked storefront glass in broken strips, falling across dust-covered counters, overturned salon chairs, and a reception desk where a faded appointment book still lay open, its pages yellowed and curled at the edges as if someone had stopped midday and never returned. The silence was not empty. It was layered, like the building was holding its breath. Margaret set her small canvas bag down carefully near the entrance, the fabric making a soft thud against the tile, and stood for a moment just listening. Somewhere deeper inside, something shifted. Not loud, not fully formed, but enough to make her pause and turn her head. 3 days earlier, she had not imagined she would be here at all. That morning, she had left her apartment with a paper grocery bag containing 2 cans of soup, a half loaf of bread, and a bottle of water, everything she owned for the next few days. And now that same bag sat on the salon floor like it belonged to a stranger. She pulled her worn jacket tighter around her shoulders as she walked deeper inside, each step producing a brittle crunch from broken glass hidden beneath a thin layer of dust. A calendar still hung crooked on the wall near the back room, frozen on September 2003, a small photograph clipped to it showing a smiling woman in a stylist apron, her mother, holding a pair of scissors midair like she had been caught in motion. On a counter nearby, a ceramic coffee mug sat half full of hardened residue, and beside it, a pair of reading glasses lay folded exactly as if their owner might return in a minute. Margaret touched the edge of a styling station, her fingers leaving clean lines through the dust, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with memory. She lowered her bag fully to the floor, unzipped it, and pulled out a thin blanket, spreading it in the only relatively dry corner she could find beneath a boarded window. The floor creaked under her weight as she sat, the sound sharp and unfamiliar in the stillness. She tried calling her sister once, no answer, then again straight to voicemail. The phone screen lit her face in the dimness, then went dark as she set it down beside her. A faint draft moved through the room, carrying with it the smell of old metal and something faintly sweet, like dried shampoo still trapped in the walls. As she adjusted her position, her shoulder brushed against a section of wall that felt different. Smoother, newer, almost recently repaired compared to the rest of the decaying interior. She frowned and pressed her palm against it, feeling no hollow sound, only resistance. But then a second touch revealed something subtle beneath the surface. A line, too straight to be natural, too deliberate to be decay. Before she could examine it further, a soft metallic creak echoed from the back hallway. Like a pipe settling, or a door shifting somewhere it should not have been able to move, and Margaret slowly turned her head toward the sound, realizing for the first time that she was not alone in a place that was supposed to have been empty for years. Margaret crouched low, brushing a layer of broken glass and debris from the center aisle, each sweep of the broom, scraping against the dusty tile with a sharp, metallic rasp. Her knees ached, the thin foam of her worn sneakers offering little cushion, and her palms were cracked from gripping the broom so tightly. A drizzle from the leaky roof landed in scattered droplets on her jacket, each cold splash reminding her that the building had no heat and that the radiator outside had long since been capped. She shifted a fallen styling chair to cover a hole in the floorboard, testing her balance as the wood groaned under her weight, and she pulled a rag from her bag to wipe down the counters, revealing decades-old hairpins and a coffee mug chipped at the rim. Every swipe uncovered another layer of memory. Faded appointment cards, a ledger page torn out and crumpled into the corner, and an old receipt pinned under the cash drawer with a name she didn't recognize. Margaret paused, lifting the drawer. The lock clicked oddly, resisting the pull, and she glanced at the floor where a small, brass key had slipped from the crevice, almost hidden beneath a shard of mirror. She picked it up, turning it over in her fingers, trying to reason it was just a leftover from some previous employee. Yet the engraving on the metal edge didn't match any of the locks she had seen so far. Rolling the tarp over the leaky section of the roof, she listened to the soft drumming of rain on the tin above, the sound a rhythmic reminder of how long this space had been abandoned, yet still breathing, still waiting. She heated a small kettle on her camping stove, the hiss of boiling water sharp in the silent room, and poured it over the dirty mop bucket, rinsing dust and grime away in preparation for scrubbing the floor, trying to imagine a clean space amid the chaos. An old photo, face cut off and bent at the corners, tumbled from a corner shelf as she stacked debris into a cardboard box, her hand brushing across the torn edges. She recognized her mother's handwriting on a small label attached, yet the date and address didn't match anything in her memory. Margaret adjusted a cracked window with a piece of plastic she had taped into place, checking that the daylight could filter in enough to see the mess. Then, lifted a broken hair dryer from the floor, inspecting its cord for frays. The apartment bills she had carried in her coat pocket from the week before now felt lighter in comparison, insignificant next to the work of reclaiming this ruin. Each motion was deliberate. Cleaning, moving, inspecting, repairing, not just surviving but taking ownership, asserting control in a place everyone else had abandoned. And as she straightened the counter, a soft metallic clink echoed from beneath a pile of dust-covered magazines. Something had shifted as if nudged by her hands, the angle of the pile revealing the edge of another envelope tucked flat beneath the journals, unseen until now. Margaret froze, heart tight, realizing with a slow, mounting awareness that while she had been cleaning, the salon itself was guiding her toward a hidden secret, a piece of the past she had not yet understood. Margaret was crouched near the counter, brushing dust from an overturned magazine, when a soft knock came at the broken front door. She froze, hand on the brass key that had slipped from the drawer, heart tightening at the unexpected presence. A man in his late 70s, wearing a faded denim jacket and a baseball cap dusted with sawdust, stepped inside cautiously, holding a paper bag of groceries and a small lantern. "Thought you might need these," he said, voice rough but warm, placing the items on the counter. Margaret's eyes flicked to his hands and the ledger page lying beside the cash drawer. She noticed the same name scratched faintly in the margin that she had seen on the receipt from the hardware store last week. "You knew my mother?" she asked quietly, watching the way he hesitated, fingers drumming on the bag. He nodded slowly, eyes drifting to the corner where the photo with a cut face lay, lips pressed in a line of memory. She helped a lot of folks here, more than anyone remembers, he said, then paused, looking down at the floor, avoiding the year scratched into the old calendar. Margaret stepped closer, gesturing to the ledger and the key. Does this key match anything you know? Or someone else's record? His eyes softened as he took the key, turning it in his fingers, the brass warm under his thumb. That belongs, well, it belonged where it was meant to be, he murmured, almost to himself, before handing it back with a nod. Margaret's gaze followed him across the salon, noting the faded name carved beneath the counter, the chipped coffee mug, the half-empty bottle of hair tonic. Everything carrying a fragment of her mother's life, her care for the community, the small acts of protection and kindness that had been layered into the space. Some things, some nights you just do what needs doing, he added, voice catching slightly as he glanced toward the back room, the ceiling sagging near the corner where a pipe had leaked years ago. Margaret crouched, eyes scanning the room, tracing the outline of the new panel on the wall she had noticed the day before, the edge of which aligned precisely with a floorboard recently replaced, the faint scratch of a tool mark visible. He glanced at it, then quickly averted his gaze, saying, "We kept what had to be kept. No one else would have understood." She tilted her head, examining the ledger and the key together, realizing this man had known more than anyone had ever told her, and that the space around her, the broken chairs, the sticky counters, the faint smell of varnish, was threaded with acts of quiet care and protection, a hidden history of her mother's generosity. As he stepped toward the door to leave, he paused, looking back over his shoulder with a small, almost imperceptible smile, and said, "Take care of it. It's still alive in ways you might not see yet." Margaret's eyes lingered on the bag of groceries and the lantern, the key in her hand, and the carved name beneath the counter, understanding for the first time that this place was more than shelter. It was a fragment of life, preserved and waiting, and that every act she made here could honor what had been quietly given. Margaret stood still for a moment after the man from earlier left, the groceries and lantern still sitting untouched on the counter, as if they belonged to a different version of her life. The salon had grown quieter in a way that felt unnatural, not empty but attentive. Then she heard it again, the same faint, uneven sound she had noticed earlier, but this time she didn't ignore it. She moved slowly across the floor, stepping over broken glass and avoiding the warped tile where her foot had sunk slightly the day before. The pattern was there now, undeniable. A faint line in the dust that didn't match natural decay, a narrow path where something had been dragged or moved repeatedly over time. She followed it with her eyes until it led directly toward the back wall, where a section of paint looked subtly newer than the rest, almost too clean compared to the surrounding decay. Margaret reached out and pressed her knuckles against it. The sound changed immediately, solid on one side, hollow on the other. 3 days earlier, she would have dismissed it as imagination, but now every detail in the room felt like it had intention. She fetched a small screwdriver from her tote bag, the same one she had used earlier to pry open the drawer, and tapped along the edges of the panel. The rhythm shifted near the bottom corner, a softer, almost empty echo. Behind her, the rain picked up again, tapping steadily on the patched roof, while a faint hum from an old radio in the corner flickered on and off without power, as if memory itself was short-circuiting. Margaret glanced toward the counter where the man from the hardware store had left earlier. The groceries remained untouched, but something about the way he avoided the back room kept echoing in her mind. She crouched lower and noticed a floorboard just beneath the panel that didn't align with the others, its edge slightly raised, newer wood compared to the rest of the room. When she pressed it, it shifted a fraction of an inch, then stopped. She tried again, this time inserting the screwdriver's tip into the seam, feeling resistance before hearing a soft metallic click from somewhere inside the wall. The sound was not random. It was mechanical, deliberate, like something had been locked from the other side long ago. A car engine passed slowly outside the broken front window, headlights briefly sweeping across the salon interior, revealing the faint outline of wiring running unusually along the base of the wall, leading not toward any visible outlet, but disappearing behind the newly patched section. Margaret paused, breath tightening, and checked her phone out of habit. No new messages, just a blank screen reflecting her own tired face. She set it down and pressed her ear against the wall, listening. At first there was only silence, then a faint hollow echo, like space where space should not exist. When she pulled back, her fingers brushed against a tiny indentation carved into the edge of the panel. Too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be decay. And she realized for the first time that the salon was not simply hiding things, but guiding her toward something that had been sealed away on purpose, waiting for someone who would not stop at abandoned or worthless. And in that moment the screwdriver slipped slightly into a thin seam she hadn't noticed before, revealing the first unmistakable gap behind the wall. Margaret knelt on the floor, screwdriver in hand, gently prying the edge of the panel she had discovered. Her fingers slick with dust and the faint residue of old varnish. The wood resisted at first, groaning, then shifted with a soft snap that echoed through the empty salon, revealing a narrow cavity behind the wall, just wide enough for her hand to slip inside. Her pulse quickened as she fished in the dark, brushing against folded papers and a small, stiff envelope tied with a brittle string that smelled faintly of old paper and smoke. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of decades in her fingertips, and laid it on the dusty floor. The envelope was yellowed, the edges slightly curled, and a faint smudge of ink marked the corner, as if someone had tried to obscure a detail years ago. Margaret slowly untied the string, her hand shaking, and unfolded the paper inside. A deed stamped with a faded county seal, the ink uneven and slightly run from moisture. The address matched the salon exactly, but the signature at the bottom was not the one she remembered from the documents the clerk had handed her. Someone had added a second name in a tiny, precise script that made her breath catch. She pressed her palms to the floor, sitting back on her heels, and read over the numbers. Listed. A series of amounts that repeated in strange patterns, and a date that preceded her mother's recorded ownership by nearly a decade. Her eyes darted over a small note tucked beneath the deed, handwritten in her mother's familiar looping script. For Margaret, when she is ready. She folded the papers slowly, smoothing the creases with care, and tucked them into the inside pocket of her coat, careful not to crease them further. Reaching for her phone with one hand, she considered calling the retired neighbor from the hardware store for insight, but paused, realizing that this discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why had the signature been altered? Why were the amounts repeated? Why did the date not match the official records she had seen? Margaret exhaled slowly, pressing the deed closer to her chest, the musty scent of the envelope mixing with the lingering perfume of hairspray and varnish in the room. The rain pattered steadily on the tin roof, a soft percussion against the growing silence, and somewhere beneath the floor, the faint hollow sound she had heard before reminded her that the wall had more to give. She stood, gingerly replacing the panel and marking the seam with a fingertip, her eyes catching a small embossed monogram in the corner of the deed she hadn't noticed before. The initials matched her own, intertwined with a tiny date. Her heart stuttered as she realized, in that quiet moment, that the envelope, the deed, and the note were not just remnants of her mother's life. They were deliberately placed for her, pointing directly at Margaret and the hidden legacy of her family. Margaret sat on the cold floor of the salon, the deed still trembling slightly in her hands as if it carried heat from another time. The single handwritten note, for Margaret when she is ready, seemed to pulse under the dim light filtering through the cracked window. She unfolded the second sheet again, slower this time, and noticed something she had missed. A faint ledger reference number stamped in the corner, partially overwritten by ink that didn't match the rest of the document. Her breath tightened. The paper wasn't just a deed. It was connected to something larger, something structured like a hidden record of years. She pulled the envelope back out of her coat and found, tucked beneath the deed, a thin bundle she hadn't fully opened before. Pages bound loosely with aging string, edges softened by time, smelling faintly of oil, soap, and old tobacco. When she untied it, the first page revealed a ledger, not of property alone, but of names, dates, and small handwritten notes beside each entry. Some lines recorded payments marked medical, others rent relief, and one entry simply read, "Kept family in house, do not disclose." Margaret's fingers hovered over the ink, recognizing none of it at first, until she saw a recurring signature in the margins. Her mother's, but accompanied by another initial set she didn't know, pressed repeatedly beside financial adjustments and property notes. From the corner of the room, the retired hardware store man's words echoed in her memory. She helped a lot of folks here. More than anyone remembers. The ledger confirmed it, but in fragments like pieces of a life never allowed to be fully seen. Margaret traced one entry dated 15 years earlier, where a payment had been made toward someone's hospital bill, followed by a note. Do not let Margaret's name be tied to this. Her chest tightened. Why would her mother erase her name from something like this? A soft creak came from the back wall again, but she didn't move this time. Instead, she pulled out a second item hidden within the bundle. A small cassette tape, its plastic case scratched and slightly warped. The label read only one word in faded ink: if found. Her hands shook as she set the recorder she found earlier near the counter and inserted the tape, the machine clicking and whirring before releasing a low, distorted hum. At first there was only static, then a voice, her mother's voice, older than she remembered, tired but steady. If you're hearing this, then they didn't let me explain it in time. The recording began, punctuated by the faint sound of a chair shifting and something like rain against metal. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, the sound of that voice collapsing years of silence into a single moment. The recording continued in broken segments, mentioning the Salon, the land records, and a man's name spoken carefully, almost warned against. Someone involved in making sure the property never stayed in the family hands. The hardware store man's earlier hesitation now made sense. He had known fragments but not the whole. Margaret leaned closer, listening as her mother's voice softened. I kept your name out of it so they couldn't come for you. Not while I was alive to stop them. A long pause filled the tape, filled only by static and distant echoes of what might have been a church bell or factory horn. Margaret's eyes fell back to the ledger, where her own name suddenly appeared in a later entry, years after her mother's death, marked beside a note about final transfer conditions not yet executed. Her pulse quickened. Someone had continued writing after her mother was gone. Someone had kept the system alive or controlled it. She looked around the salon, no longer seeing just decay, but structure. Hidden pathways, deliberate panels, wiring that led nowhere obvious, and a history that had been carefully layered beneath dust and neglect. The cassette clicked softly as it neared the end, and her mother's voice returned one last time, barely above a whisper. Margaret, I didn't leave you nothing. I left you what they couldn't destroy. The tape stopped. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before, and Margaret realized the salon was not just a place her mother once lived. It was a map, and she was already standing on the first mark her mother had drawn for her, guiding her toward something still unfinished, still buried, and still waiting for her name to be fully understood. Margaret's hands were still trembling from the revelation in the ledger and cassette when she finally forced herself to leave the salon, the envelope and deed safely tucked under her coat. She drove slowly through the winding county roads, rain tapping against the windshield, toward the county records office 4 miles away, the brakes squeaking under her careful pressure. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above rows of metal filing cabinets, the air smelling of ink, aged, paper, and cleaning solvent. She set down her bag, pulled out the deed, and compared the parcel number to the official records, line by line, her fingernail tracing the embossed numbers. Her pulse quickened as she discovered that the property included not only the salon lot but an adjacent parcel, long overlooked, with documented mineral rights and a legal easement that allowed access to a small creek running through the land, information her siblings had never mentioned. Margaret photographed each page, careful to note the ledger entries that matched these parcels. The same handwriting from the envelope indicating transactions for medical bills and community support. She checked the signature again, comparing it with the original deed, noticing subtle variations that had been corrected decades ago but still traceable, confirming the legitimacy of her claim. A flicker of movement through the corner of the office window drew her eye. A black SUV parked outside, engine idling, tinted windows reflecting the rain. She shivered, realizing someone might be watching, perhaps tracking the parcel. The county clerk, a woman in her 60s who had always been polite but distant, glanced over at her and whispered, "Be careful who you show that to. Some folks would give anything to make it go away." Margaret nodded, heart hammering, and snapped another photo of an old map pinned to the wall, which marked the same adjacent land with a red circle and handwritten notes in a margin she recognized from the ledger. Outside, her phone buzzed. A call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring once, then declined, a chill running down her spine. Back in her car, she took out the bank envelope found in the salon, carefully opening it to reveal statements showing trust funds in her mother's name. Long thought to be depleted, now tied to the property and partially funded to benefit the local community, including medical bills and school tuition for children her mother had helped quietly. Her fingers tightened around the papers, realizing that this junk property had been a hidden cornerstone of a much larger legacy. Financial, legal, and moral, linking her mother's name to deeds of care and justice. She looked through the rain-streaked windshield, seeing the black SUV still parked silently, and suddenly understood why her siblings had called it worthless and why the hardware store man had hesitated when she mentioned her mother's actions years ago. The space she had cleaned, the ledger, the note, and the deed were not just history, they were a target. And just as she turned the envelope over in her hands, the front door of the office opened with a soft click, and one of her siblings, the very one who had laughed at the salon weeks ago, stepped inside, eyes narrowing at the papers spread across the counter, voice clipped and polite. "Margaret, we need to talk about what you're holding." Margaret had barely settled back in her apartment with the deed, ledger, and cassette when a knock at the door made her start. She opened it to find her ex-husband standing there, a stack of documents in one hand and a neatly folded suit jacket over the other, his expression polite but unreadable. "Margaret," he began, voice calm, "I'm just trying to be fair. That property, it's valuable, and I think it's in the family's best interest that we handle it properly." Behind him, the city solicitor's notice and a copy of a recent lien were taped to the frame, the paper crisp and threatening. Margaret felt the familiar ache in her knees, the sting in her wrists from lifting boxes earlier, and the tightness in her chest. She had $211 in the bank, no lawyer, and half-unpacked groceries on the counter. He pushed the documents slightly forward, careful not to touch her hands, adding, "We just need you to sign this acknowledgement. Procedure requires it. You don't have to give it up. It's just administrative." Margaret's fingers brushed the envelope tucked into her coat, the one holding the deed and note from her mother, and she shook her head slowly, refusing to sign. "I'll need to verify everything first," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hand. Her ex-husband's jaw tightened, the smile still there but thinner, eyes flicking toward the papers she had spread across the table. Ledger pages, photographs, receipts from hardware stores, the faint ink on the deed. He nodded as if conceding the argument, yet his posture suggested a quiet calculation, a knowledge that she lacked resources and time. She quickly photographed each document with her phone, storing the images in a secure folder, while her eyes caught a faint marking on the ledger, a line that seemed to have been erased or overlooked, a witness name scrawled in pencil next to an old payment entry. The ex-husband's hand hovered near the doorway, polite, restrained, but there was tension in the air, a subtle threat in his calm. Any slip could allow him to claim the property or force a legal challenge. Margaret tucked the original deed and ledger into a heavy envelope and slid it into the bottom of her tote bag, concealing it from view. Outside, she noticed a black SUV idling across the street, the driver watching through tinted windows. She pressed her back against the door, realizing that the moment she had stepped into this apartment, she had become the center of attention for forces who previously dismissed the salon as junk, yet now called it valuable, unsafe, and crucial to family property. Her phone buzzed again, a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Are you handling 47-092 properly? Don't make mistakes." Margaret's chest tightened, and she gripped the tote bag, feeling the weight of proof she had gathered. The deed, ledger, and faint markings unseen by anyone else. She understood suddenly that the battle to protect what her mother left was only beginning, but for the first time, she held evidence strong enough to make anyone think twice. The county records conference room felt colder than it should have been, even with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and a row of daylight bleeding through the blinds. Margaret sat at the long table with her tote bag pressed against her chair leg, fingers resting on the envelope that contained the deed, the ledger, and the cassette transcript she had replayed twice that morning. Across from her sat her ex-husband, a county official, and a man in a developer's blazer who kept tapping a pen against a stack of property review documents labeled 47-092. The developer smiled first, polite and practiced. "We're here to resolve a simple matter," he said. "That structure is outdated, potentially unsafe, and frankly misclassified as usable property." He slid a report across the table. Margaret didn't touch it yet. Instead, she placed her own folder down slowly. The room shifted in attention immediately, not because of her, but because of what was inside. The county clerk, the same woman from the records office, stepped forward hesitantly and placed a second document beside the developer's report. "Before we proceed," she said quietly, "there is updated historical filing connected to parcel 47-092 that was never fully entered into the public summary." The room went still. Margaret opened her folder first. The deed came out, then the ledger pages, then the photocopied map with the red circle. Each item landed softly on the table, but the sound felt heavier than it should have. Her ex-husband leaned forward immediately, forcing a calm tone. "Margaret, this is emotional, but it's not relevant to zoning compliance. You're misunderstanding what this property is worth." She cut him off by sliding the cassette transcript printout across the table. The developer glanced at it, then briefly stopped smiling. The clerk followed with a second paper, a county ledger amendment showing mineral rights and easement value tied directly to the Salon property and adjacent land. The pen in the developer's hand froze mid-air. "That's outdated notation," he said too quickly. Margaret opened the cassette recording on her phone and played a short segment through a small speaker. Her mother's voice filled the room, faint but unmistakable, describing the property as protected community ground and referencing withheld filings tied to fraudulent transfer attempts. The county official shifted in his seat, suddenly avoiding eye contact. Her ex-husband exhaled sharply. "Audio is not legal proof of ownership," he said, but his voice had changed, less certain, more careful. Then the clerk placed the final document down, a notarized witness statement from the retired hardware store man, confirming the Salon had been used for years as a concealed trust site for community relief funds and protected land agreements. The developer finally looked up fully, his expression tightening. "This property was flagged for redevelopment clearance," he said, voice lower now. "We were told it was vacant junk land." Margaret leaned forward slightly, placing the original deed directly on top of the stack. "It was never vacant," she said quietly. "You just didn't see who it was protecting." The room fell completely silent. The developer opened his mouth, then closed it again when the clerk slid one final page forward, a corrected parcel certification with multiple verified signatures, including Margaret's mother's original filing authority. The county official stood slowly, then sat back down. Her ex-husband tried one last time. "Even if that's true, procedure allows reassessment." The clerk interrupted him gently. "Procedure also requires acknowledgement of concealed filings," she said, and for the first time no one corrected her. The developer pushed his chair back slightly. The confidence was gone from his posture. Margaret watched the change happen in real time. The room that had once belonged to paperwork and authority now belonged to something else entirely. The pen was still frozen above the paper, but no one was asking her to sign anymore. As the clerk gathered the documents for official resubmission, she paused and looked at Margaret directly. "This is no longer a question of value," she said softly. "It's a question of what was hidden, and why." And in that silence, with every file now stacked in her favor, Margaret realized the decision ahead was no longer about survival, but about what she would choose to rebuild from everything they tried to erase. The first thing Margaret noticed was the silence. Not the tense, heavy silence of the hearing room, but a different kind, the kind that follows truth finally being spoken out loud. The clerk's words still lingered in the air. "It's a question of what was hidden and why." By the time Margaret stepped out of the county building, the rain had stopped. The pavement outside reflected the gray sky in soft, broken mirrors, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was being chased. The legal decision came too. Weeks later, the petition from the developer was denied. The attempt to reclassify parcel 47-092 as redevelopment-only land was officially rejected due to concealed filings and misrepresented ownership history. The corrected deed arrived in a thick county envelope, stamped, signed, and reissued with her name fully restored as the rightful inheritor. The salon was no longer abandoned property. It was protected land. But what changed Margaret more than the paperwork was what came with it. The retired hardware store man arrived early the next morning, not alone this time. A few neighbors followed, an old waitress who remembered her mother's late-night kindness, a former firefighter who quietly confirmed the community relief ledger entries, a man who once fixed the salon's broken wiring without charging a cent. They didn't bring celebration. They brought tools, wooden planks, a new lock, fresh paint. Someone carried a small, faded photograph of her mother and placed it gently on the counter inside the salon as if returning it home. Margaret stood in the doorway as the first real light of morning poured through the repaired front window. The salon no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like something paused, waiting for breath to return. The key she had carried through fear and doubt no longer felt heavy in her pocket. Felt like a beginning. Inside, she placed the original ledger on the counter, not hidden anymore but open, its pages now understood by more than just her. The hardware store man adjusted the new lock on the back panel and stepped aside. "Your mother kept this place alive a long time before any of us realized it," he said quietly. Margaret nodded, running her fingers over the restored wood of the counter where new screws now held old structure together. Her ex-husband's petition had been dismissed without further hearing. The developer's company withdrew their interest after the audit began. No dramatic punishment followed, only removal, correction, and silence where entitlement used to be. That was enough. That morning, for the first time, Margaret unlocked the salon door herself and turned the sign hanging in the window from faded closed to a freshly painted open. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped back inside, not as a visitor this time, but as someone returning. She set her mother's photograph upright on the counter, next to the ledger that once held secrets and now held truth. The key rested beside it, not as an object of mystery anymore, but as proof of belonging. Outside, a few neighbors gathered again, not out of curiosity this time, but recognition. One of them asked quietly if she needed help setting up the morning. Margaret paused, then nodded, and as sunlight filled the salon for the first full time in decades, she realized the truth had never been buried at all. It had been waiting for the right hands to open it, and in those hands, what once looked like forgotten junk had become a living place again, steady and whole, carrying the quiet weight of everything it was always